I remember being absolutely terrified the night before.
New Orleans was one of those disaster scenarios just waiting to happen.
We had experienced one tiny sliver of this far more vast story.
We had no idea what we were getting into.
It's been 20 years since Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans. In this Weather Network special, we will be dissecting that storm through the eyes of storm chasers and meteorologists, and we'll hear from someone whose family was directly impacted by the storm. After each segment, we'll discuss what happened. Let's begin from the beginning.
2005, a date firmly stamped into the history books as the day Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast, forever altering the landscape of New Orleans and the lives of millions. 20 years on, and many still feel the echoes of this storm, the failures, the influences, and the stories it left behind.
Well, Katrina started forming in the about third week of August. We had a tropical depression out in the Atlantic, and it combined with another tropical wave, and then became a tropical depression to the southeast of Nassau.
When Katrina started, no one predicted it was going to be this historic storm. You never want to attribute any type of human qualities to storms, but some storms do seem to have a resilience about them. I think Katrina surprised some people when it crossed Florida and still came out the other side quite strong. It didn't lose a lot of steam. That says to us as meteorologists, this storm's got a lot going for it.
During Hurricane Katrina, I was actually working in Montreal for Environment Canada. However, I'm born and raised in New Orleans, and all of my family during Katrina was in New Orleans. 3 days before the storm struck on August 29, 2005, I was telling them, this looks bad, you need to leave. But being typical New Orleanians, having lived through numerous other hurricanes in the past, my parents had no intention to evacuate.
A group of us storm chasers positioned ourselves in Gulfport, a little over an hour to the east of New Orleans, and watched as Katrina made landfall along the border of Mississippi and Louisiana.
We arrived in Gulfport, Mississippi in the late afternoon of the 28th.
Yeah.
So we had pretty much no sleep for several days at this point, going into what is to become the most dangerous spot on planet Earth.
Yeah.
That's Katrina there. She's coming.
Katrina was a Category 5 storm at this point. It had entered the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
And it started to take that turn to the north, and it intensified. It hit the loop current, which is this area in the Gulf of Mexico that has very warm water, and that warm water is fuel for this storm.
It was basically like providing it with rocket fuel.
It got turbocharged,
and
it just exploded in size. It was about half the size of the Gulf of Mexico, if not more. It was humongous, and strengthened to Category 5. And it was coming straight for us. And then we got that warning that was put out by the National Weather Service in New Orleans. Devastating damage expected. Hurricane Katrina, a most powerful hurricane with unprecedented strength, rivaling the intensity of Hurricane Camille of 1969. Most of the area will be uninhabitable for weeks, perhaps longer. Power outages will last for weeks, as most power poles will be blown and transformers destroyed. Water shortages will make human suffering incredible by modern standards. Unbelievable. Well, that's when it got real.
Yeah, that's when it got real.
This is a disaster scenario, and it was the most probably emotional and catastrophic sounding discussion anyone had ever seen, and it got a lot of press, and thankfully so. This discussion said basically, if you do not take action, like, you will die. It was very to the point, and it got people to take action.
I remember being absolutely terrified the night before. We had no idea what we were getting into, but once the storm started to ramp up, and I'm actually in it, I can react to what's happening.
Yeah.
And I'm living in that moment. I'm not thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow.
And we're back. I want to introduce our illustrious panel. We'll begin on my far left, and that would be George Kourounis, adventurer and storm chaser. In between, we've got Mark Robinson, our storm hunter here at the Weather Network, and Dr. Doug Gilham, one of our meteorologists here at the Weather Network. And I want to begin with all three of you were in the South when Hurricane Katrina hit. So we're going to get some very unique perspectives from all three of you. I was not there. I remember being glued to the TV late into the night before Katrina hit, and just feeling the dread because of how the newscasters were talking about this storm. It was massive. You couldn't miss that satellite shot in the Gulf of Mexico. It was just such a huge storm. But I'm going to start with you, Doug, because you are not only a meteorologist, but you are a teacher of meteorology. You were teaching in Mississippi at the time. I mean, the Gulf of Mexico, no stranger to storms. We had already had 11 named storms that year in the Atlantic Basin, not necessarily in the Gulf of Mexico. But when you were watching Katrina and its development, did you have a sense of what kind of devastation it would cause? And what led you to that?
Well, in the week leading up to it, it became evident that Katrina was going to follow the tendency of a few other storms during that season and many storms during recent seasons, and that was overachieving in intensity and also taking a track further to the west, which meant it was going to get into the Gulf, into an environment very favorable for rapid intensification. The problem is when you're in the Gulf, there's no escape path. You will make landfall. The question is, will you make landfall in a sparsely populated area or in a densely populated area, which amplifies the impact? But it really wasn't until a couple days before landfall that you realize this had the potential to truly be a disaster.
2005 was a unique hurricane season. I'm going to just throw it over to Chris Scott. We have a clip from him talking about that season specifically.
When I was initially growing up looking at weather, the really disastrous hurricanes were few and far between. 2005 changed everything because then we had this onslaught of storms, and people always look for causes, like why was 2005 so bad? Well, it really all comes down to the jet stream. And we had a setup in 2005 where we had this big, basically pinwheel of high pressure that sat over the Western Atlantic, and it just kept rotating disturbances from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean and then through the kind of hurricane alley and then driving them into the Gulf of Mexico. But that wheel was responsible for driving these systems in over very warm water and just a perfect environment for big storms. And it didn't change. They just kept coming one after another. We had to use the Greek alphabet at the very end of it.
Okay, another perspective from our chief meteorologist here at the Weather Network, Chris Scott. You know, we often think about Katrina devastating Mississippi, Louisiana. A lot of us forget that it actually made landfall in Florida first. Mark, you had a lot of preconceived notions of what this storm was going to be. You alluded to that. And then it turned out to be not what you expected. So what did you expect versus what was the reality?
You know what? I think I expected something less. It just kept getting stronger and worse and worse and worse. As you know, George and I were driving down, we were watching this thing. We were able to sort of keep an eye on this as we were making our way from Toronto down to New Orleans. And by the time we had gotten close to there, we realized that we weren't dealing with something minor. This was going to be something way more than we thought. And I do remember us literally discussing how close to the water we should be while trying to document this unbelievable storm. And it was, you know, as far as we knew, it was coming in right on top of us as Category 5. And we said, you know what, we're going to pull away from New Orleans and not go into the eye wall. And that changed when the storm made a slight right turn and nailed us with the right eye wall.
Yeah, and you weren't expecting that.
No, that's the whole thing. We were not expecting that.
George, when it comes to prepping, I mean, I know you were ready, you had the car packed. How do you pack for a Category 5 hurricane? And did you feel like you were prepared?
Yeah, you never feel like you're prepared for a Category 5 hurricane. But what you really have to do is think of safety and preparation ahead of time, right? The most important thing is to pack everything you need to be safe. So that includes safety equipment, helmet, goggles, first aid kit, things like that. And then you'd never want to be a burden on the emergency services. So you have to assume that you're going to be trapped there for a long time. You have to be completely self-sufficient, like a space mission. So food, water, alternate forms of communication, tools, everything that you think you might need, maybe, jam it into the car and then basically hope for the best. But also going with a good team. It's not the kind of thing you want to go into alone. You need someone to watch your back, and they need you watching their back. So the people I was with, I felt very confident with. The location that we had was very good, and we were as prepared as humanly possible. But still, there's so many variables.
Right. I'm going to ask you both this question. So whichever one wants to answer first. Since you were together storm chasing this storm, what do you decide when you're saying, you know what, I'm going to be on camera. I want to show people the most impactful event possible. I want to show them this storm and make it interesting, but I need to be safe. People need you to be safe who are watching. People close to you want you to be safe. So how do you balance these two things, and do you always get it right?
I gotta say, as we went in, I remember you saying, "There's the perfect spot," and I went, "Are you crazy? I can see the water from there." You were right.
This was a multi-level steel reinforced concrete parking garage. And I chose that spot because we could get up above the storm surge, because we knew it was going to be about 10 meters above normal high tide. So we knew the area was going to flood. Plus, as the hurricane comes in, of course, the winds shift. And in the hours of the storm, we could reposition our car so that flying debris wasn't smashing out our windows. So all of these things sort of came into the equation, if you will, and allowed us to film from many different perspectives throughout the storm, including shots of ourselves to show us how the storm is impacting a human being. Like you see me crawling across the floor.
Yeah.
And those are very powerful visuals. And it's kind of limiting because you can't really extend beyond that parking garage because it's far too dangerous to step outside.
Yeah, and I remember, just being in the parking garage, and sort of, this was my second hurricane. So George, you've been through a few more, but this was my second one. So I was relying on him a lot to sort of say, yeah, this is going to be okay. And I remember seeing that, going into that parking garage and going, what am I doing?
George, you had something really impactful that you said in that last documentary portion that we were showing. So I want to show that clip again, and we're going to discuss how you were feeling, not just how things were looking.
Being absolutely terrified the night before. We had no idea what we were getting into. But once the storm started to ramp up, and I'm actually in it, I can react to what's happening.
So what I hear from that, you were terrified, and then you were just in it and doing the thing. So to me, that sounds like high anxiety, not knowing what to expect, and then full survival mode. How does that work? So what's going on in the head?
Like a lot of things in life, the waiting is the hardest part, right? So you have that anticipation, especially with those warnings coming out of the National Weather Service saying that appliances and small vehicles are going to become deadly airborne missiles. And we are at ground zero. And even if we were to leave right now, we would still not be able to get out of that disaster zone. So once the storm really started to ramp up, your brain switches from anticipation mode to react to what's happening around you in the moment mode. And when you're doing that, you're kind of distracted from the anxiety, and you're just dealing with the things that you have to deal with right now. And so it actually became a much less stressful situation at the height of the storm than the 24 hours leading up to the storm, just from a human psychological perspective, even though at that moment it was the most dangerous place on planet Earth.
Right. I'm going to show our viewers now, as we head into part 2, what that looked like being in that storm in real time.
That's off. Just after 6 a.m., Katrina made landfall along the Gulf Coast. The eye passed just east of New Orleans, but here in Gulfport, we were hit head-on.
It was like this continuous, someone cranking up the volume, basically, and every raindrop felt like a needle, and every little pebble felt like a bullet hitting you. And
Yeah.
I remember the winds gusting at some 200 kilometers an hour, and I remember thinking, this is kind of like driving at double highway speed with your face out the window in the rain. And that's sort of the best description I can give to people of what it felt like being in there.
Yeah.
One thing that really sticks out to me was the sound of the hurricane. It was like a symphony of destruction, if you will. You had the low rumble of the buildings shaking, and then you have like the mid-range screaming of the wind through the trees, and then you've got this percussion of breaking glass and smashing objects all coming together in this chaotic cacophony.
When I woke up in the morning, when it had just skirted by southeast Louisiana, the prevailing narrative at that time, believe it or not, was New Orleans has dodged the bullet because the winds weren't as bad. So there was a period of time, maybe 6 to 12 hours, where I came into work that Monday thinking, wow, the worst case scenario did not happen. But here's the thing, the damage had been done.
Mayday, mayday! Mayday, mayday! Coast Guard, Coast Guard! Mayday! Anybody picking this up?
This was sort of our worst nightmare for New Orleans coming true, because we knew there was going to be a very large surge. You look at all the surge projections for Category 5, it's going to overtop the levees or force its way through the levees, and there's going to be a great deal of trouble. The levees had actually breached right when the storm was coming in, particularly the 17th Street Canal. The flood wall there had broken.
My mom and dad lived within blocks of one of the main levees that breached. Fortunately, my family, they were able to finally leave at the last minute. But there were, I believe, more than 100,000 people that did not have the means to evacuate, and they were stuck in the city. It's always difficult to evacuate a large city, but you have to realize that 80% or more of the city did flood. The city is literally shaped like a bowl, surrounded by water, and once that water gets in, it can't get out.
We sort of decided that we should probably get out of here sooner rather than later. Of course, at this point, all the cell networks are down, so we have like no communication with the outside world.
Yeah.
And we didn't know how bad it was. We had zero idea how widespread the damage was, what had happened in New Orleans.
Yeah.
And we just cleared a path and basically started driving north.
I remember being at the Weather Network, giving all the tapes to one of the guys, started ingesting it, and then we started to see footage of New Orleans, of the entire city underwater, and I went, what is this? I think at that point realized that we had literally experienced one tiny sliver of this far more vast story than we had anticipated.
Katrina was truly the disaster that New Orleanians always feared. But it was even more so the disaster that meteorologists knew was a possibility.
And we're back. Hurricane Katrina made landfall as a Category 3 hurricane. Now, Mark, George, you were there during landfall. You felt the brunt of that storm, as we could see in that video. But you didn't know, as a lot of us didn't know, what would be happening to New Orleans and the devastation that would happen there. Nearly 1,400 fatalities, billions in damages, 100,000 people left stranded for 5 days, things that we could not imagine. Doug, you were living down there at the time. You weren't storm chasing. That storm was chasing you, apparently.
Yes.
You could tell me a little bit about your personal experience, but I also want to hear your thoughts on the levees. You know, there's 140,000 kilometers of levees across the United States. They're supposed to protect communities from flooding. Why was New Orleans so vulnerable?
Well, much of New Orleans sits 1 to 2 meters below sea level. And we had a Category 5 storm surge, even though it was a Category 3 storm as it came ashore. Now, typically, when you're to the west of landfall, you're considered relatively safe. But as the storm approached, it pushed the ocean water into Lake Pontchartrain. And then as it continued in, the north winds that are offshore on the back side of the storm pushed that storm surge into the levees that were supposed to protect New Orleans. But when you sit below sea level and the levees failed, then the city went underwater after the storm had passed.
And then stayed like that.
Right.
The drainage was a huge issue.
Exactly. I mean, that's the problem when you sit below sea level in an area that's vulnerable to hurricanes. And there was no easy way to get the water out of the city. You are, like I said, 1 to 2 meters below sea level.
We really heard from George there, how it felt, how it sounded in that storm. I have another clip. I just want to roll the clip of Mark, who's also talking about how it sounded, because it seems to me that when you're in Gulfport, Mississippi, with winds that strong, the sound is, something that you can't get away from. So let's hear what you were listening to, Mark.
what struck me was you could see down the road. I remember standing up on the one part of the parking garage, you could see directly down the road, and you could see the casino that was basically a barge offshore, and that was something that we were watching all night. And as we got into the daylight, you could not see down the road anymore, but you could hear all this bangs and crashes, and I remember distinctly the sound of tinkle, and that was the glass being smashed and then sort of driven along the ground.
Okay, you both know really how to paint a picture when it comes to describing a storm. I mean, you've been in so many since then, but I know you were fairly new to the whole situation, Mark. Let's start with you, Mark, about what it felt like to be there in the center of it and the sounds that were happening around you.
You know, it engages all the senses. I mean, and it's overwhelming to all the senses. You know, you could hear the smashes and bangs and crashes and the tinkling, I know this sounds a bit weird, of glass being like literally blown down the street. But you couldn't necessarily see any of that. Like it was just sort of a wall of white, and you just hear these mysterious sounds off in the distance. And you know something really bad is happening out there, and then all of a sudden you might see something, you know, fly past and you realize that something, you know, like something's let go. And like, yeah, and I remember just the sound almost in your chest, like where it was like this subsonic roar. If you remember something like, you know, how it was.
Yeah, George is like walking on, I mean, he's crawling. Is that you crawling on all fours with the helmet on? It's hard to tell because of the storm.
Yeah,
I'm going to show that.
If you were to stand up at that point, I literally would have been blown away by the wind. That was at the peak of the storm. One thing you don't really think about during these storms is the smell and the taste of these storms, because you get the combination of that salt water, the trees that have been ripped apart, the gas mains that are broken so you can smell the gas, the sewers that have backed up in the floodwater that you're wading through. So this is, as Mark was saying, a full sensory experience.
The National Hurricane Center says that it takes about 3 days to evacuate a city of 1 million people. Now, George, I'm going to direct this towards you. A lot of people wonder, why didn't everyone leave? Can you, and I know you've talked to people in New Orleans after the fact, you've revisited the city. What do survivors say? What were the challenges of getting out of New Orleans before Katrina?
Well, it wasn't just New Orleans. The entire Gulf Coast was being evacuated. So you had Louisiana, you had Mississippi, you had Alabama. So there were multiple streams of millions of people heading north. So lots of congestion. There were problems with gasoline supplies. And of course, there's always people that stay behind because they think it won't happen to me. I'll be fine. I've lived through hurricanes before, but they don't realize that the survivor bias. But you never know. It's gonna come. And in this case, it did come. And people overestimate their ability to ride this out, and they underestimate the ferocity that Katrina was going to bring. I think, though, there's also a political aspect to it, in that you had large portions of the city that couldn't necessarily get out, right? Because you had, you know, just I don't have a car. I can't easily access public transit. I take the bus. Yeah. Well, they have no place to go to. Yeah. I mean, it's expensive. You know, it's expensive to go and stay at a hotel for a week or more. So there was definitely that aspect of it where a lot of people just simply could not leave.
Yeah, it wasn't just the lead time. Some people just didn't have the means to leave.
And precisely.
And they ended up in the dome.
It's a combination. Every tragedy is a combination of several small things compounding together, rather, to create a much larger, in this case, tragedy.
Mark, you said that you and George only experienced a sliver of the devastation of Katrina. Looking back now, and with all the experience you have today, is there anything you would have done differently? Because you mentioned that you didn't realize what was happening to New Orleans until you had returned. Would you have approached this storm any differently, knowing what you know now?
Honestly, probably not. I think we had, a really good position. We were in a safe spot. I think at the time I thought we were way too close, but George convinced me that, it's all fine. I mean, there was a surreal moment where we were standing on the top of the parking garage after we'd received, one of these, NWF warning, and sort of going, okay, if this building comes down, where are we going to be to film it and not get hit by the building coming down? I think that's a very surreal moment. But in terms of where we were, how we would have documented, I don't think I would have changed anything.
I think maybe linger a bit longer afterwards. We got out of the city quite quickly afterwards, and we were miraculously able to do that. But had we known what had gone on in New Orleans, maybe we would have taken the opportunity to help document that and be part of the campaign to showcase that to the world of what was happening in the city, because there was so little information coming out of New Orleans.
I do remember, though, the National Guard came in and said, everybody out, or you're like, we're going under curfew, so either you're out or you're in your house, and we sort of had to go.
You'd probably not be able to get into New Orleans regardless.
No, but we probably could have gone at least a little bit towards it. So yeah, I hadn't thought about afterwards.
Hindsight is 20/20.
That's what I'm saying. What would you do differently, knowing what you know now? Obviously, you didn't know at the time. Doug, technology, when it comes to forecasting, is advanced in 20 years. We know this working at the Weather Network. We see how forecasts have improved. If Katrina happened today, everything the same with the storm, would we have been better able to forecast it or do anything differently?
Maybe a little bit. I mean, technology has improved and forecasting has improved some. I don't think anywhere near enough to have saved and salvaged what happened for the reasons that you already mentioned, with the survivor bias and the reasons that people, even with more lead time, there's thousands of people who would not have evacuated. So it really highlighted that, I mean, you need to nail the forecast, but nailing the forecast is not enough. Communicating risk and planning well before the storm happens is just as important.
Okay, so we're going to move into our next segment. You know, we know that forecasting can be challenging, but I don't think anyone forecasted what happened in the wake of Katrina and what happened to New Orleans. So in this next segment, we're going to examine the days, the months, and the years that followed the storm.
Not one territory, not one governor, not one soldier or airman failed to answer the call.
The old adage, send it now, send it all, became the mantra.
All of our efforts right now are channeled toward helping the people of this beleaguered Gulf Coast.
In the days after Katrina made landfall, New Orleans was a city on its knees. Entire neighborhoods sat underwater. Tens of thousands awaited rescue on rooftops and attics, and inside the Superdome, an estimated 30,000 people sought shelter and hoped more help would come. Rescue teams poured in from across the country. The Coast Guard, National Guard, police, firefighters, and hundreds more worked non-stop to rescue more than 30,000 people from floodwaters and collapsing homes. But for far too many, help came too late. In New Orleans alone, nearly 1,400 lives were lost and more than 800,000 residents were displaced. It wasn't until October 2nd, 43 days after landfall, that the last of the floodwaters were pumped out. In the end, Katrina caused over $125 billion in damages, the equivalent to over $200 billion today, and has left many with scars, both seen and unseen.
Post-Katrina, there is some PTSD. People, oftentimes, including my parents, have a hard time talking about Hurricane Katrina. Here we are 20 years later.
I thought we were beyond losing 1,000 people to a storm in North America. Just inconceivable given the resources that we have, given the warning that's possible. Hurricanes aren't tornadoes. They don't just pop up within minutes. You see them coming, and still so many people died. I think that was shocking.
Hopefully a once-in-a-lifetime thing. My understanding is that approximately 450,000 people did not come back to the city after the storm, ever. And people kind of fail to realize that people are the ones who are chefs and bartenders and policemen and firemen. And all of a sudden, New Orleans shrunk to a very small town, and a lot of businesses who survived the storm did not survive the lack of population in the months and couple of years after the storm.
About 9 months after Katrina, I went back and actually went to New Orleans. I saw things that I couldn't even digest with my brain. Around the entire city, there was a brown stripe, and that was the high water mark. And just one neighborhood after another, after another, after another, that had just been waterlogged for so long, just completely destroyed. Every single destroyed home has a story behind it. Thousands of stories that that I didn't know what happened to these people. And it was just block after block after block of that.
Most of us in New Orleans felt like in the first 2 years after the storm, we're not sure if the city's going to make it back.
That have passed since this devastating event, much of the city has been rebuilt, though some neighborhoods never returned. Major redevelopment efforts have led to growth in the city's population. However, many criticize the influences of gentrification and the displacement of longtime residents.
Part of being a good meteorologist is having an imagination. So if you've seen a lot over your career and you go, that storm went this direction, what if it did this? Is that possible? Yes, it is. You can't say when it's going to happen, but Katrina, I think, made me and a lot of meteorologists realize these kind of low probability, high impact scenarios, they do come to fruition.
I think what shocked me and most people even more is what happened to the city in the weeks after the storm. The rescue response was extremely slow, and the repair response was extremely slow. With that being said, I will tell you, here we are 20 years later, maybe we're back. The city is very much back. The city is lively. We're back up to over 1 million people in the city population. Granted, a lot of those people who came to the city are people who are not originally from here anymore. The city will always be vulnerable just because we are surrounded by water. However, the infrastructure with water mitigation has greatly improved in the last 20 years. Levees are now stronger, reinforced. The water evacuation system, underground canals and whatnot have been improved and enlarged. Things have changed forever, but we welcome everybody here because it's a great and fun and unique city on the planet.
And welcome back to our special coverage of Hurricane Katrina. We are looking at this storm from the perspective of meteorology and storm chasing, but it would be irresponsible if we didn't talk about the broader context of this storm. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, there was a bipartisan congressional hearing, and what they had discovered was that there was failures on several levels of government. City officials, state authorities, and FEMA that led to the deaths of people. So we want to acknowledge that there was a huge political side of this story, but I'm going to shift back to the weather, the meteorology, and ask this question of all of you. I'm going to throw to a clip, but I want to ask you this just so you can think about it for a second. Why is it important that a Canadian media weather outlet discusses, covers Katrina in depth, and covers these storms in the U.S. in depth in general? So let's now go to Chris Scott once more.
As we're communicating to Canadians, it's a little bit different because we're not communicating to people in the past directly, but they may have family and friends that they can talk to and persuade to get out of the way. They may have property down there. So we were trying to cover it as a Canadian lens on a U.S. story that also had major Canadian implications.
Okay, and you are often the ones who are down in these storms in different parts of the planet, not just the United States. Why is it important that Canadians see these stories?
The reality is that North America is North America. The border that we put there separates two countries, but the reality is the weather doesn't care. So things that affect the U.S. quite often affect Canada. So if you look at the remnants of Katrina, that made it all the way into Ontario. So there's definitely that aspect of looking downstream, or looking at what's coming towards you, or looking upstream, at what coming towards you. And I think that's an important part of it. And the reality is it's a human interest story. It's a story that people they want to see and they want to hear about what's happening with this massive natural disaster.
And a lot of Canadians spend a fair amount of time in the U.S., especially in places like Florida, right? So you never know exactly how many Canadians are going to be down there. And Canada does get hurricanes. I'm sure a lot of people on the East Coast remember Hurricane Juan and how much destruction was brought by that. And there have been so many. So there's certainly a lot of good reasons to report on events like this.
We are a global society, and so many people are even asking me, I've got friends, I've got family down there, what should I tell them? Like it impacted many of us who weren't on the coast.
Right, you have family and friends on both sides of the border, Doug, so yeah, you have a very special interest in this as well. George, this was people wanted it to be a once-in-a-lifetime storm, a once-in-a-lifetime event, given the devastation. But let's take into consideration climate change and the fact that these kinds of storms are becoming more frequent and more intense. How, as a society, are we expected to prepare, evolve, get ready for this kind of storm if it happens again? Is this enough for us to say, okay, now we saw what happened, now we know what to do?
When it happens again, because it will. It's just statistically, it's going to happen again. Don't get into some of the more complex nature of how climate affects hurricanes, but if you've ever watched a disaster movie, we are at the point at the beginning of the movie where the scientists are screaming at the politicians, informing them that something bad is coming, and the politicians are ignoring them. That is where we are right now. And certainly it's not just storms. We're dealing with droughts, fires, flooding in certain places. It's a very complex system, this atmosphere that we all live in, and we're having a tremendous effect on it.
And a scary fact is that Katrina did not follow the worst case scenario track for New Orleans. So a stronger storm on the worst case scenario track is almost inevitable at some point. Are we prepared?
But it's not just New Orleans that we have to worry about. I remember being in Tampa last year, and we were really afraid that we were going to see Katrina Part 2. If it came in with, I think it was Milton, and we came in with 20 feet of storm surge into Tampa Bay, that was bad. That was going to be very bad. We also have Miami. That's another city that's vulnerable to this. Go over to Galveston, and there's another city. So we love to build on the coast. And we expand these cities every single year. Those cities just get a little bit bigger. And so we increase the target. We're increasing that little bullseye every single year as we put more and more people on the coast. And it's something we have to really take into consideration. If we're going to put people there, want to move there, we have to be prepared.
The best thing we can do is learn from the mistakes of the past and implement these preventive measures ahead of time.
It's been 20 years since you were down there at Katrina. You've had 20 more years of experience chasing storms, chasing hurricanes. How did Katrina specifically influence how you do your job now? Mark, I'll start with you, then we'll go to George.
You know what, Katrina for me, I mean, I sort of laugh a little bit here, but Katrina sort of began my career. It was really the first time at the Weather Network we had somebody live on, right in the center of this, and I was calling in on a constant basis. There was no video, we couldn't get video back, but we could literally do this as a live report, and that was the first time I'd sort of been on air. And so from there, that sort of began things and sort of went to Storm Hunters, the show, and all the stuff that I do at the Weather Network now.
George?
It was a humbling experience, and I think it instilled in me a lot more respect for Mother Nature, and also the humanitarian side of documenting these things. I feel that as someone who has the privilege to be able to choose to go to these storms where most people are trying to evacuate, or maybe they cannot evacuate, I think it's up to us to educate and help out wherever we can, as much as we can, in addition to documenting the natural phenomena, which then becomes a disaster when it affects communities.
And Doug, as a forecaster, how did Katrina shape the way you look at these storms now and how you forecast these storms now? Or has it?
Well, it hasn't really changed how I forecast, other than really highlighting the fact that the worst case scenario can happen. But, there's a storm chaser and a weather lover in all of us, and you're in awe of the power of the storm. But I lived down there for months and years afterwards, and you do see the human impact. And you recognize the weather, which you love, can drastically change lives and take lives. And so that is a life-changing experience for me. And it really highlights you can nail the forecast. That's not enough. We need education. We need preparation well before the storm happens.
Katrina really taught us a lot. We saw the lives lost. There were lessons learned. We saw the resilience of a beautiful city in the people who live in New Orleans. And it really changed the way we look at storms, we track and chase storms. And it really forms the way we do things even here at the Weather Network now. Katrina was that impactful of a storm. I want to thank my panelists for being here with your insights on the storm specifically. George Kourounis, Mark Robinson, Doug Gilham, I'm Kim MacDonald. On behalf of everyone here at the Weather Network, thank you so much for watching.